Welcome, everyone, to Poets in Conversation. I'm Phyllis Klein, and tonight I welcome Ruba, Ahmed, and Carolyne Wright, who first met in 1996 at a Bangladeshi youth forum, where Carolyne was keynote speaker and Ruba was a college student. They reconnected both as poetry teachers at the Wright-orama at Hugo House in 2021, when they attended each other's classes. Each one of these poets has won many accolades. Their achievements are considerable, and they are both generous, fascinating, kind, and wildly intelligent women. Carolyne is fluent in English, Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, and Bengali. She's written 17 books total, including poetry, essays, and translations. She's lived in many places nationally and internationally. Ruba has roots in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Bangladesh. She also lived here in the San Francisco Bay Area for a few years. She's just published a second book of poetry, has 2 young children, and teaches many grateful students, including me. Sometimes I think what these 2 poets have in common, or something I think that they have in common, and we can talk about this and see if they agree, is the experience of differentness. Ruba, as a first-generation Philadelphian-born daughter of immigrants, a writer of color with a Muslim surname, and Carolyne, as a seeker of immersive experiences with people of different cultures, someone who lived for 4 years on Fulbright and other fellowships in Calcutta, India, and Dhaka, Bangladesh, where she edited an anthology of love poems of Bengali women poets. And that's just one of her in-depth dives into another culture, not to mention all of her translations. We're going to focus on their most recent books, both deep dives into important relationships, the death of Ruba's father and Carolyne's poetic memoir about an interracial relationship. We'll have so much to discuss and hear about, so get your questions ready. I start the reading, I often read a poem my own, but with these readers, there's too much richness, and I just had to read a poem of theirs. So I'm going to start with a poem of Carolyne's, and then at the end, I'll read one of Ruba's to close us out. And so because we're focusing on Carolyne's book, Masquerade, about her a relationship that she had many years ago, I thought I would take the opportunity to read about Eugenia. And those of you who know Carolyne's writing might already have met Eugenia, but she is, I think she's an alter ego. I don't know if Carolyne has another name for her, but, and she actually, Eugenia wrote a whole book, or maybe 2, I think. And the one that I'm going with is called Mania Klepto. And this is Eugenia's Confessions, and the poem is called The Confessions of Eugenia. I eat too many Twinkies. Oh, by the way, Eugenia has a really squeaky voice, but I'm not going to do that. I eat too many Twinkies. I ask God to make me virtuous, but not just yet. I pick tater tots off other people's plates. I order 40 large pizzas for the house where my old boyfriend lives with that new babe of his, and I use his credit card number. I go through my new boyfriend's wallet looking for photos of his old girlfriends. I get most of my ideas off the internet. I steal the rest of my ideas from the renegade saints with names like Augustine and Aloysius and Simon Stylites, who spent years standing on pillars in the deserts of Iraq. I stock my bathroom with toilet tissue swiped from fast food restaurant dispensers. I swear on Epimenides Perplex, whatever that is. I take naps anytime, especially when stuck in rush hour traffic. I'm a Capricorn with Kundalini rising. I make videos of myself on YouTube, dressed entirely in marshmallow paste and little pink squiggles of birthday cake icing. Okay, in high school, I snuck out with all the punk poets in my homeroom and flamingo the vice principal's front yard. Now I'm casing the lawn of the college president's McMansion. I raise my grade point average like a hot air balloon. I tell only lies in my confessions.
Thanks. That was a great reading.
Oh,
Wonderful.
thanks, Carolyne. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Ruba. And here we go. Ruba Ahmed is the author of Bring Now the Angels, with poems featured in the New York Times Magazine, The Slow Down, and Poetry Unbound. Her debut book of poetry, Dhaka Dust, won the Bakeless Prize, and her poems have appeared in numerous journals and are widely anthologized. She's a recipient of the Florida Reviews Editors Award, Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Memorial Prize, and the Catherine Bakeless Nason Fellowship in Poetry awarded by the Breadloaf Writers Conference. She teaches poetry nationally, and in January 2021, joined the faculty at Warren Wilson College's MFA program for writers. She loves eating gluten-free desserts, shoveling mulch, walking among trees, and drinking coffee, but not necessarily at the same time. And maybe should we put shoveling snow in there? I don't know. So Ruba, thanks so much, and looking forward to your reading so much.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for those thoughtful introductions. And I just want to start by saying thank you for inviting me here to be part of this reading series. And also thank you to Len and Dawn, who I know are doing things behind the scenes to make this event happen. I'm so thrilled and honored to be sharing the Zoom stage with Carolyne, whose work I've admired for many, many years, going all the way back to my college days, as Phyllis mentioned. And I especially have admired her work translating the poetry of women poets from Bangla to English, Bangla being my first language. And thanks to all of you for being here on a Saturday evening or afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I have about 8 poems to share, and these are all from my second book, Bring Now the Angels, which was published at the height of the pandemic in April 2020. By the University of Pittsburgh Press. And the book has 2 sections. The first section deals with personal loss around, it grapples with my father's 3-year battle with multiple myeloma and our family's loss of him. And then the second half, which I'll also read from, broadens out to more public forms of loss. The first poem is called The Feast. The feast. My father is hosting the final picnic. He rolls a melon back and forth on the slate table to steady it and slice, each piece bleeding onto a white plate. The coals turn gray but still flicker and burn, with raw meat slung on top of the grill, oozing blood red to clear. In the river bordering the grove, a lone man paddles his arms, stomach pressed to a blue surfboard. Black and white ripples radiate from him while boats knock against the pier. The children gather their frisbees from grass, their volleyballs and rackets, appearing and disappearing in bright shirts like confetti. Their voices rise and fall. It is late. The sun shines, but not for much longer. The golden hour has begun. For a moment, the moss-covered trees glow lime green, frozen in their looming heights. My father, white shirt, gray pants, silver wristwatch, glasses, he always cut the melon. The plates are ready. The food is hot, the watermelon cold and seedless, and our lives, for a moment, are an untouched meal, perishable and delicious, one we've barely begun to taste. This next poem is called Zofran. Thank you. This next poem is called Zofran, which is the name of an anti-nausea medication. Zofran. Then the atrophy of appetite. We brought your favorite stew, potatoes, the forbidden beef. We brought coffee with sugar and cream. Surely the smell of it, the steam, you would not. So we scalded our tongues with food meant for you. We found the coconut sweets you liked, but you would not. The insult of their stripes, pink, brown, white, a flag from a country to which you couldn't return. We slipped the candied cubes from the wrappers meant to keep them fresh, innocent, and useless. A covered dish arrived. Don't open it. Another tray arrived. Don't open. Meal after meal you would not eat. You could not. The sea in you refused to cease movement. Even the doctor's amber pills you heaved aside like so much beach glass. Outside, each leaf began to bleed yellow like dampened saffron as we yielded one grief to the next. This next poem is the poem from which I plucked the title of the book. So this is the poem sort of halfway through the first section of the book, and it's called Bring Now the Angels. Bring now the angels to test your pulse as you sleep. Bring the healer, the howler, the listening ear. Bring an apothecary to mix the tincture. We need the salve, the tablet, the capsule of the hour. Bring sword eaters and those who will swallow fire. Fetch the guardian to flatten the wheelchair, to hoist it toward heaven. The public shuttle awaits the ceaseless trips to the clinic. To the bedside manner, summon witness. This medic's disdain toward patients, the physician's dismissal of pain, and call the druggist again to drug us senseless. Bring a nomad to index our debts, tuck each invoice into broken walls of regret. Call the cleric, the clerk, the messengers divine. Summon someone, collect the prayers, buried or burnt, tied to stones, sunken seas, dunked underwater until all dissolves. Bring now the scribe, let it be written. There is no shepherd, no Sherpa, no moonlight guide for these, the darkest journeys of our lives. Who will lift the shuttle above the outposts of the living? Who will watch it rise and rise? Who will clear a path among all the wreckage? Who will weave a nest for all the birds of passage? Who will bridge the gap between savage and salvage? Who will sing over wilting stalks, rough husks, silk still gleaming like hair in a dream? This fourth poem is the last poem I'll read from the first half of the book. And since we are just at the beginning of the month of Ramadan, I thought I'd read this piece that's about both skepticism and faith. It's called At Sunrise. First glint of sun at horizon, it happened upon me. Day creeping from darkness to blue dawn, the slow emergence of thought. I remember days my father was alive. I woke early with my sisters and washed in the cold. Religion a destination, 2 hours toward the city, silent commute, as though calendars could occasion faith twice yearly, and yet I didn't mind. My mother's sunflowers nodding along the drive as we departed. My mother wrapping her shari, wrapping her shawl, wrapping us in belief's gauze, dark morning sky, time of prayer, time of contemplation, of the silence before speech, cool as a slate, as impartial a God, a shadow of possibility. My friend believes in no God, but I cannot say what rises from mist when a body disappears into the unforgiving ground. The ablutions, the time wasted, the boulder of regret. I repeat words uttered when others hear of the loss of my father. I'm sorry, sorry, sorry. Kneeling now, stranger, prayer, no mosque, temple, church, and yet how awkward, what comfort to pray. So the four remaining poems that I'll read, thank you. The four remaining poems that I'll read are all from the second half of the book, which I mentioned broadens out from personal loss into more public forms of loss. And in this poem, at the time of writing this poem, I was thinking a lot about the notion of resistance, which was a term that was being thrown around a lot in 2016. And just sort of musing on the question of what does resistance include? You know, what does it mean to engage in a public act of resistance, and what might it mean to resist privately? What evolved was a poem about women who lived under Taliban rule in Afghanistan. This one's called Underground. Don't say face of the moon, not voice like morning dew. Instead, say hook in the tongue, try barb in the flesh, say knife in the wound. They are turning their locks to paint their faces and their daughters' faces. They look on as the girls regard their eyes in mirrors, in the long cracked mirror of history and war. They paint themselves into existence inside the shuttered rooms of their hearts, where freedom still bristles. They are stripping veils from their faces and letting loose their glossy hair. They are singing with their daughters, first softly and then loudly in unison. They have taken their girls underground. They open battered books to teach them letters and words that might save them. Some shave their daughters' locks so the girls might walk a different route each day with cracked books tucked into bags of apricots. They prepare for the minutes apart, the hours. They wait for what seems days, months, years. But first, they kiss. They embrace. They take one last look at each face. In the midst of this second section, there are a couple of poems that are about corruption of various kinds. So I'll read a couple of those. This one is called The Process. So grateful the process is clean and faithful. Does not cheat like a disenchanted spouse dozing on a haggard couch. Take heart, the process is always right, is automatic, phlegmatic, clean, cold, and always refreshing. Brewed to perfection, you might say. Brewed to perfection, some say. Guaranteed to satisfy, you might say. Give thanks, the process is organized, synchronized and sterilized, optimized but not disguised, like the grown man at my door long after trick-or-treaters have gone, hand outstretched, mask covering his eyes. Thankful too for the oversight. No boogeyman standing over the drain pipe, clogging it with debris when no one sees, so he can charge you your life for the cleaning. Name your price. And how shall we praise the instruments of investigation, so shiny, so new, gleaming with silver and glass. No traces of fingerprints or funders. No whispered voices softly requesting of the results of first glance. There's no need to come clean. We know the process won't fall prey to steak and wine, and then blink upstairs to spend some time, just a little. The process doesn't. The process wouldn't. The process isn't that kind. Okay. So in a similar vein, this next one is called Choke. And this one is a retelling of the tale of Jack and the Beanstalk. And it plays out in two voices. So you'll hear a questioner and a voice responding. Choke. Was there a beanstalk, a golden egg laying hen? No, just a magic seed, a courtyard of crooked men. Was there a giant? There must always be a giant. In how many ways did the giant try to choke you? He did not attempt this with his bare hands. In how many ways did the giant try to choke you? He didn't choke me. He choked the competition, flooded the market with magic seeds. Was magic involved? How else could he ensure economic chokehold? How else the power to ban sales of nature's seeds? Was magic involved? How else could he choke off a normal trade flow? How else, in revitalization's name, a new world economy? What life were you doomed to live? Must there always be doom in the developing world? What life were you doomed to live? Lifetime poverty, I was told. How did you pay 1,000 for your first bag of seeds? Alone, 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 alone. Forgive me, my children, my wife, alone. How did you know the seeds were enchanted? They only grow once, my pockets emptied without end. And what of the pesticides? The giant implied the magic seed has little need. Save your rupees, save your children. What did the seeds grow? Nothing every time. How many times did you try? Too many, then I took my life. Who weeps now over the blighted fields? My wife, my children, my God, what could I do? How many witnessed you drinking the pesticide? On our first date, we secretly strolled and tossed scraps to birds. What did the giant say when you died? From his heights, will he notice the smell of blood? Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. Who will pay the loans now that you're dead? Please tell the world what is happening here. Okay, and I have one more poem to read, but before that, I would love to take a moment to recognize Phyllis, who I think, described me as her teacher, when really, she and her poems are as much a teacher to me as I could possibly be to her and her work. And it's been such a pleasure getting to know her as a reader and as a writer and as a person through our work together. So I just wanted to say a special thank you to Phyllis and to read one of her poems. I've had the pleasure of reading her poems over some time now, and I'm holding a copy of The Full Moon Herald, which so many of Phyllis's poems are both beautiful and devastating. So I'm going to read one of those. It's called Opening the Beauty Cage. Here you are living in a fashion magazine. Here you are, a sunflower in a field of sunflowers, faces turned away from the shadows you stand in. On a page, in a photograph, on a billboard, here on a runway, in a movie, a high school yearbook, an office, a bedroom. This is you, girl in a burqa, athlete who has to dress as a boy. You, girl in your mother's sweaters. You, woman hiding in baggy shirts. Here, a flock of cranes in flight, and there, a murder of crows. When did you know you would never be beautiful enough? And so for my last poem, I'm reading one called Phase One. And this one came about when I was thinking about the idea of forgiveness, and I got very caught up in the idea of the notion of self-forgiveness as a precursor to our forgiveness towards other people. And I'd just like to say thanks again to Phyllis, Dawn, Len, and all of you for being here, and especially Carolyne, whose work I'm looking forward to hearing. Phase One. For leaving the fridge open last night, I forgive you. For conjuring white curtains instead of living your life. For the seedlings that wilt now in tiny pots, I forgive you. For saying no first, but yes as an afterthought. I forgive you for hideous visions after childbirth brought on by loss of sleep. And when the baby woke repeatedly, for your silent rebuke in the dark, what's your beef? I forgive you for letting vines overtake the garden, for fearing your own propensity to love, for losing again your bag and routes from San Francisco, for the equally heedless drive back on the caffeine-fueled return. I forgive you for leaving windows open in rain and soaking library books again, for putting forth only revisions of yourself with punctuation worked over instead of the disordered truth. I forgive you. For singing mostly when the shower drowns your voice, for so admiring the drummer you failed to hear the drum. In forgotten tin cans may forgiveness gather, pooling in gutters, gushing from pipes, a great steady rain of olives from branches, relieved of cruelty and petty meanness. With it, a flurry of wings, 13 gray pigeons. Ointment reserved for healers and prophets. I forgive you. I forgive you. For feeling awkward and nervous without reason. For bearing Keats's empty vessel with such calm, you worried you had perhaps no moral center at all. For treating your mother with contempt when she deserved compassion. I forgive you. I forgive you. I forgive you. For growing a capacity for love that is great, but matched only, perhaps, by your loneliness. For being unable to forgive yourself first, so you could then forgive others, and at last find a way to become the love that you want in this world. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so entranced. I forgot to unmute myself. Ruba, thank you so much. And let's get Carolyne to join you and me and have a little conversation about that amazing reading.
Thank you so much, Ruba. That was wonderful. That final poem, which is basically, isn't it the first one in the book? Let me see. Yeah. Phase one. I just, it's a really powerful start to the book, an opening gesture.
Thank you. Yeah, and it was one of the last poems I wrote for the manuscript, so it felt like the right one to put as sort of the prefatory poem before the rest of the other work. But
I think we should all read it every day, multiple times a day. It's I mean, as a therapist, I think it's kind of a major issue that we all have. Yeah, is is how to really love ourselves. That you say it so obviously you say it much better than that.
Thank you. I mean, the background behind that poem is that after the election of 2016, I found that I was carrying around a lot of anger, And, it wasn't sort of this general anger towards the state of the country and the world, but also really personal anger about people that I had known for a long time, people I'd gone to high school with, and, in many ways who were taking action against themselves. And it started to get really toxic, I think especially because there was that individual level of anger and resentment toward people and a feeling of helplessness. And so, what I had felt like I had to turn it around somehow. And so in thinking about that idea, turning inward, sort of like, I'm not sure about everything out here, but the idea of turning inward and starting there seemed to make a lot of sense to me. It felt authentic to the kind of dilemma. And in the meantime, that poem.
Yeah. I do want to give some recognition to what people have written in the chat. Mostly quoting lines that they really loved. What life were you doomed to live? That one, Harry and I both wrote that one down. That poem is so chilling, especially. Did you start writing that before what was happening in Iran, or were you writing that?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah, the one about the veils, taking off the veils and letting your hair down.
Underground. That one. So the book came out in 2020. Many of these poems were written in the 5 years leading up to that.
I see. So that was prescient, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it was really came out of that thinking around the idea of resistance here, because I did feel like there were some being called in many directions to kind of take on politically and civically active, and I did. I got really involved in politics as one way of changing the anger I was feeling, to do something productive, right? To do something with all that energy. At the same time, it made me think hard about the idea of resistance, right? What it meant to, for example, sit comfortably in my home and make phone calls versus the challenges that some other people might face in other settings, and what resistance might look like for them. And that was sort of the thinking or questioning that led me to these, doing some research into what it was like for women.
Just gave me the chills, just thinking about what's going on there now, and how you nailed it in the poem.
Thank you.
So, Carolyne, do you have any question you'd like to ask Ruba, or oops, you're muted.
I have to unmute myself. It's easy. I try to stay unmuted. So, but yeah, I was really interested in, it's interesting to be, and I find this with many people who, are in this country because of choices that their parents made, to immigrate to this country and to seek a new life here, and the kind of effect that has on the children and grandchildren. And I was very interested in, and often it has to do with the confrontation or the interaction with the culture from which the parents have come, and that sort of mixture of cultures that the children have. They both have the American culture, and they have the culture, the heritage culture of their parents and ancestors going back. And there's a funny term for that in in the Bengali, ABCD. You know what that means. But anyway, I was an American-born confused Deshi, and Deshi is a person of that country, right? So it's a kind of an ironic and self-deprecating, but also humorous and, I don't know, I suppose affectionate way of teasing oneself. And I find it interesting that the interaction with the other culture is really well handled here. I loved in that poem At Sunrise, the rising early to wash in the cold, before prayers, and then the as though a calendars could occasion faith twice yearly. And I was thinking of that expression. There's an expression in Bengali which is similar to the Christmas and Easter Christian, you know. And I was thinking, I love the humor with which people of all cultures, you know, interact with their own culture, you know, and their own foibles and their own strengths, you know. So yeah, that's just a comment, you know, not
That's a wonderful comment. Yeah.
yeah.
Do you want to speak to that, Ruba?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment, Caroline. And I think, you know, when I think about those experiences growing up, my family lived in, you know, relatively small towns in Ohio. So, for example, in the month of Ramadan now, in many places around the world, everything kind of shuts down. You know,
Right.
everyone's fasting together. And so for my parents, there wasn't that sense of community for them. And then that made it, you know, extraordinarily difficult for them to create that sense of community for us. So growing up in places like Chillicothe and later in Athens, there was this feeling of like, you know, we would drive to Eid, we would drive to this event. And the cultural, the religious events there were like for Eid were very multicultural. You know, everyone was gathering in a giant gymnasium on the campus of some university or college in Columbus. So there was this sense of like going somewhere to engage in certain aspects of our family's culture, but not having the opportunity to do that on sort of a daily basis at home, or even to see ourselves reflected anywhere we went, whether that was school, the grocery store, the park. So there was, you know, there was that sense of feeling sort of on the outside in many ways there, and that changed over time. You know, I think that term ABCD is one that that I both felt ring true for me in many ways through some phases of life. But there definitely was a point when I realized, you know, there aren't any clean categories for anything. It's not that I have to feel like I'm, you know, on the one hand, not this identity enough, and on the other hand, never going to fit on, you know, in other identities, but rather that it's really a blessing to have you know, to straddle those two worlds and to be able to sort of pick and choose and be thoughtful about, okay, what are the parts that I agree with or find meaningful or that I want to continue in my life? And what are the parts that don't ring true for me? So, but it took a long time to get to that point. There's less struggle involved for sure.
Well, I hope that the comments I made back in 1996 to that group of Bangladeshi, mainly Bangladeshi American young people, I had to do with that. It was like, you know, you're here, you feel the great pull, the attraction, and the peer pressure of America. But when your parents speak to you in Bangla, make every effort, answer them in Bangla, because then you get a second language. You get a whole other language for free at home. You don't have to pay for it at the university classes, right? And especially Bangla was very difficult. Where could you study Bangla back when I started to? There was almost nowhere, you know? So it's a language that you pretty much need to learn at home, you know, or go live in an area where that it is the main language.
Which is what you did, right?
And I learned some here, but mainly there, you know.
Yeah, really good point, Carol. I can just picture you giving that lecture just the way you're saying it now.
And I was giving it in Bangla wearing a sari.
Oh my goodness. Oh, wish I could have been there. So I do see some other comments in the chat. I just want to mention, let's see, Ed says the falcon cannot hear the falconer. He found some Yeats echoes in there. Were you thinking about that, Ruba?
I was not. I'd actually be curious to hear from Ed, which, you know, whether there's something specific that.
Yeah, Ed, what were you thinking of? Do you want to say or? No, okay.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Ed.
You'd
Thank
feel
you for
free
the
not to
comment.
talk. Yeah, that's a really interesting comment. And let's see, Muriel says she found Zofran quite touching and was surprised at how the title frames all of the poem's contents. Yeah, so
Yeah,
was that what you were going for when you wrote it, or?
you know, part of what I'm thinking about when I'm writing, I'm really drawn to the sound of words. And so Zofran is indeed an anti-nausea medication, and one that, you know, the doctors prescribed for my father. But part of what intrigued me about the word, just from a sound perspective, was its similarity to the word saffron, which I use late in the poem. But certainly in terms of, I think, titling a poem can be so challenging, and it can be hard to make the call about whether it should be a short title or a longer title that gives more context. And so in this one, for a reader who knows what that medicine is, or even who recognizes it as the name of a medication, it seemed like the right fit without having to provide a lot of other context for what unfolds. So thank you for that comment, Muriel.
Yeah. So actually, I think I'm gonna introduce Carolyne now, and then we'll move on to her reading.
I just saw a question from Billy Clem that just came in. If you want to, he just posted it. It's
I don't think I saw that one. Let's see.
Let's see.
Is the writing of poems about a beloved father's passing helpful when grieving? Yeah, actually, let's hold that. Okay, you read my mind there, Billy. I had the same question, and I thought it would be wonderful to ask that after Carolyne reads, to come back to that. So if I don't get back to it, please remind me. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, well, thanks, Ruba. Thanks again so much. Really beautiful, beautiful reading, and so many words and images that just come together so beautifully. Thank you. And now I'm going to introduce Carolyne. It's really my pleasure to have both of you. It's my pleasure to introduce Carolyne Wright, whose latest books are Masquerade, a memoir in poetry, and This Dream, the World, and she's holding it up, a new and selected poems. And that book, that title poem from that book received a Pushcart Prize and appeared in the Best American Poetry in 2009. So let's see. That just, I have to stop there for a minute because that's such an honor. A Seattle native who has lived and taught all over the country and on fellowships in Chile, Brazil, India, and Bangladesh. She has 16 earlier books and anthologies. I have to laugh. What else can you do in the face of that productivity? Anthologies of poetry, essays, and translation from Spanish and Bengali. She is a contributing editor for the Pushcart Prizes, and has received NEA and 4 culture grants and a Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award to Salvador, Bahia, Brazil for 2022-23. She has recently received Bangladesh's highest literary award for service to Bengali language and literature. And that goes back to, really. And that goes back to the book about the Bengali women writing love poetry. Yeah. Let's see. Carolyne also loves coffee, Afro-Brazilian dance. There you go. Conversation and reading in several languages. Boy, I wish that I could say that. And planting native vegetation in the garden spaces of the Seattle condo complex where she lives with her husband. And so let me pass over the mic to you, Carolyne. We're looking forward to your reading.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Phyllis, for having me and for inviting me for this event. And thank you so much, everybody who is here in attendance. I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to read, as I said, I'm going to read from this book, Masquerade, with its amazing cover. It looks like a combination of those Fillmore West posters from the 60s, as well as Mardi Gras. And it's supposed to be like a Mardi Gras mask. And that's one of the reasons it was called Masquerade. That's the title poem. But I'm going to go through the poems pretty much in the order in which the sort of events that are recounted here took place. It is a memoir. Most of the events happened exactly as created, but with some reimagining. And changing of names so that people, to protect the guilty, except for myself. And also forgiveness is a big theme in here. And also, although there's a great deal of difficulties and conflicts that are kind of recreated, reenacted, there's also a sense of forgiveness of everybody involved. So I'll begin with the poem called Round at First Sight. And notice at first sight, usually that's a phrase with 4 words in it. And the first one is left out here. So all you have is at first sight. And it's a round, which is a form. You'll hear the repetition with variation. Through the window's louvered blinds, you glide in profile across the room, angled pitch of your hips, almost a dancer's, backlit by a single kitchen bulb. That's all. Through twilight's translucent blinds, you glide through backlight that falls 4 square on the outside veranda, where I hover, waiting for my door to open, glancing through the next door window, where you glide in profile, the room falling in 4 square light onto the veranda at my feet, next to the studio's caretaker turning the key in my door, angle of your dancer's silhouette flooding my breastbone with sudden fear. Or is it the single kitchen bulb that silhouettes you in profile in your studio, a reversed mirror image of my own next door, where the caretaker turns the key so that I can step inside my mirror image in reverse? Next door studio, where I will live a year beside you. Fear's light falls on all 4s at my feet, your profile in silhouette, the blinds half open. Have you noticed my moment's gaze that goes on a year until I step into my studio and close the door? Your image profiling mine through louvered blinds? Now, this is a memoir, of 2 artists, and they meet at an artist's residency, which you may recognize. The first section of the book is called Cape Indigo, but it is a cape. It's in the northeast quadrant of this country. So the next poem is when all of the residents who are there for the residency meet the next day at an opening event, a meet and greet reception. And it's called Blame It on My Youth. I hum at the Arts Center's opening fete, a tune I've heard for the first time on public radio's after-hours jazz out of Boston. I'm happy by myself this evening, sipping a gin and tonic without the gin. Newly arrived as everyone, early October's red letter maple leaves scraping like papier-mâché scraps against the windows. Where are you as I chat with sculptors and novelists, painters and poets, all of us reading each other's name tags? Ah, yes, that center of stillness near a bookcase. You sit on a braided throw rug on the gallery floor, in faded blue jeans and pressed denim shirt, one arm folding your crossed knees to your chest. Even then, you lean into the next moment, gazing into your wine glass with a sly smile, lip syncing whose words to yourself. Have I forgotten that first sight's blow dart has already struck? If someone asked then, the question would puzzle me. Safe? Of course I'm safe. You glance up as I pass. Your attention ripples, then veers away. I'm just another woman in the room without a name yet, as conversation swirls and Elvis Costello groans on the stereo. The angels want to wear my red shoes. We haven't yet been introduced. What if the cloud of circumstance had hovered a moment, then eased off? If the future weren't already stitched to the past? This evening, We are all just starting out, all of us too young for blame. Okay, so I'm going to move because I don't want to take too long. There was a wonderful poem called The Putting Off Dance, which kind of mimics dance moves as the stanzas, go back and forth across it looks like dance steps on a floor. But I'm gonna pass over that one and go to the next one, where the woman has stopped resisting his entreaties and his pressure, and finally gives in. So that is a poem called Hello World. We rise together naked and stand before the morning's half-drawn blinds. Oceanic light surrenders itself at our feet. Afternoons, we walk along the one street spining this narrow town, with paper sacks of scallops and okra, or packages to mail, our laundry things already married in the basket. Other days we stroll salt crystal paths through pine shadow, the outer dunes beyond those boughs shifting like mid-ocean swells. We riff lines into gull-crazy air, calls and responses daring their way forward. One rope looped to another, late sun in our eyes, a lingering brilliance. Brainstorms I scrawl onto old envelopes. Who can tell which lines are yours, which mine? As the tide's twilight fulcrum shifts, the full moon rises in perfect opposition to the sun, and syzygy is your word, love uncoupled from need. We believe in such pronouncements, walking home from past the shrimp boat's silvered rigging. Evenings I chop peppers and leeks, and you stir filet into the gumbo, calling me once by another lover's name. In my bliss of unlistening, it would take years to catch up to the heart's subtractive powers, forgiving both of us our losses. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the other coast and a visit to the parental abode in Seattle, where she is there visiting her parents and brother in the parental abode, and she begins to tell her mother, introduce the subject of this gentleman she has been getting to know over the past year. So this poem is called White, as in the color, right? You need someone just like him, but white. My mother's blue eyes through bifocals, level with mine from her executive refuge at the kitchen table. My first visit home that year. Why have I shown her lines that he and I scrawled across old envelopes last winter? Reciprocal calligraphy, scrawl and response, I joke. Our brightest moments, plain as day, as night to my mother. He's not for you. The gavel bangs in her syllables. I swallow my shock beyond her knowing, nod yes, meaning no, as the opening notes of Beethoven's Pastoral in D from my brother's Steinway Grand float out of his practice room. You need someone you can live with, my mother says. Her verdict is weeks-old newspapers stacked on the chair beside her, unfiltered Camel smoldering in its ashtray by the tabletop TV. My father at his basement repair bench, breaking a radio into frequency and amplitude, statics, modulations. My parents changed to strangers in marriage's unholy alchemy. I can live with him, I say, not saying I already do. Deception's dutiful daughter, I divide my chances by another lover's silver scarab ring he'd let slip among last winter's dunes as his boyhood memories exercised their blue tick hounds. Meanwhile, I lingered at pre-dawn's vertiginous window in the blue, uncertain flicker of the pilot lamp, picking wisdom's wishbone with myself. He's not the person you are, is my mother's equivocal oracle. Who else could be, I want to ask, to sidestep what she signifies? Neither of us can live inside each other's skin. His letters already remind me. Who could glimpse through Nostradamus's darkened glass the mortal outcome of the most faithful heart muscle, both of us unjust and equal beneath our histories? What carbon crystal conjure do we need for that? Okay, I'm going to read one of the first poems that's actually set in New Orleans. And thank you, everybody. This is one of the earliest poems that I wrote. I actually wrote it at the time, contemporaneous with the relationship underway. And this describes where this couple lived at the time in the neighborhood of New Orleans, just off the French Quarter, called Faubourg Marigny. We live on Royal, between piety and desire. The old slave quarters, shotgun houses with barred windows, antiqued bronze plaques and rows of mailboxes by the door, their decor chic macabre. The planter's mad widow bursting into flame, a house full of servants going down like Moses in their chains. The river at the end of the street, not Samuel Clemens' steamboat road across the color line. Below sea level, houses of the dead float on their pilings. We stare at the masts of freighters riding at anchor above the trees. Garçonnier, the dropped roof, rooms just wide enough to show us what isn't ours. Riot lights at dusk shine on the bellies of nighthawks, and in boarded up rooms, ghost laughter echoes down airless halls. Someone sings gospel in the street after the bars close, his voice rising above Blue Mitchell on the stereo. The last bus rattles by. The sign on the front reads, Desire Florida. A sneaky way to say, get out of town. We don't like your kind. The words of the mean sheriff in the movies reminding us we'll always be strangers here. We dream of springs 100 miles inland. Every night, barge whistles sound the old imperatives. Underground rivers play the lethal blues of whirlpools. The city turns slowly on the current as we sleep. Okay, I'm going to read. Now, as you can sense, there's a great deal of sort of unease in these poems. And actually, that's one of the, I remember when I was living down there, about New Orleans, the culture of New Orleans, and also this relationship. I found the unease and the discomfort very productive. Like, I would always mention, well, if an oyster, and oysters are part of a main food group in New Orleans, if an oyster gets a bit of grit or sand in its shell, what does it do to protect itself? It creates a pearl, those layers upon layers of pearl, and it creates a beautiful thing. So in a way, the poetry was that response to the sort of existential discomfort. And so I'm thankful for that existential discomfort. So the next poem I'm going to read is called Blue Triolets. Now, triolet is a French form. Each triolet is 8 lines long, and some of the lines repeat. And they repeat, one of the lines repeats twice and one repeats 3 times. So you will hear a lot of repetition with variation. And it's a good musical form because all of these poems refer in some way to jazz or the blues. And the first one of the 3 triolets here is called Bright Moments with the Blues and You. And these were all concerts or jazz or blues musicians that we heard in those days. Bright Moments with the Blues and You. Ellis Marsalis on piano every week at Snug Harbor. Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers at the village gate. One hot night at the cookery, Alberta Hunter. Ellis playing Syndrome at Snug Harbor. Miles turning his back on everyone in the arena. Terence Blanchard's first solo at the village gate. Ellis ending his set with Z Blues at Snug Harbor. Sarah Vaughan's Sodin sous Samba at the village gate. And the second triolet here is called House of Blue Lights. We were writing a book on the blues together. We sat at jazz club tables with the candles lit. We studied chord changes and the devil's measure. Such big plans. Our book on the blues together. On Desire Street, we heard the devil's engines backfire. Aphrodite shimmered on stage in an indigo light. We did our best with that book on the blues together. We stood up from that table, blew the candles out. And the final one in this section is called Blue Room, which is a jazz club in New Orleans, which we visited a number of times. I think it's still there. So much love and trouble in that room when Aphrodite shimmied between tables in indigo light, and the Devil's Dance Band struck up a bluesy tune. So many hopes ran into trouble in that room. Miss Mouth, you used to call me, Lighthouse Grin. You weren't trying to change me, not those nights. So much love and trouble in that room where Aphrodite shimmied between us in indigo light.
So Carolyne,
yes.
Let me just interrupt. I think you have time for one more.
Okay. I am going to decide on, I'm going to go to a poem that takes us beyond this period to a re-encounter years later. And it's called Ghazal Other Than Yours. And it's a ghazal form, which is a form I think you all recognize. And it goes to, it's a poem I know Ruba also has written ghazals. We have both committed ghazals. So it's called Ghazal Other Than Yours. It beginning with a line by Fez Ahmed Fez. And those lines were translated from Urdu by Agha Shahid Ali. Ghazal Other Than Yours. How could one weep for sorrows other than yours? That grief-struck summer, I seek no refuge other than yours. In that midnight room, alone with you after so long, I want no deep song other than yours. Night descends its spiral staircase, unfolds its sable patterns on the bed. No skin satin other than yours. You're my Shiva with a blues guitar, I teased you once. What laughter in those days other than yours? Will you get in trouble for this? Your question as you take me. Whose trouble? Whose face on the pillow other than yours? Those ghosts, our years together. Have I crossed 3 states for embraces other than yours? Your skin's scent of musk and arrowroot, could I forget? No flesh rises between my hands other than yours. Shiva's marble vein haft I ride all night, whose body speaks through dreams other than yours. If you say the word, I'll stay. You slide to the bed's far end. What silence so eloquent other than yours? For weeks I would cry out to you in dreams. No steps would retrace themselves in dreams other than yours. We have it out in dreams as we never had. What debts recollected other than yours? Next morning, you're miles away across the room. No history won from struggles other than yours. Fez cried, don't ask me for that love again. That morning, I drive away alone over a horizon other than yours. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carolyne. Wow. What an amazing reading. I'd like to, I saw everybody was applauding, so why don't we see if we can give Carolyne some kudos for her reading. Does anybody want to make a comment? You can unmute, raise your hand and say something. I know there are hearts. Yes. I see hearts, yeah.
Ruba, I'm thanking everybody, giving everybody a little love.
Yeah, well, it's coming right back at you. Ruba,
right, thank you.
I would love to just jump in and say how beautiful and moving those poems were. And, you mentioned the notion of forgiveness, and I think that really comes through in these poems. There's such a tenderness and generosity toward a young speaker, younger version of the speaker. And I think, I hear your poems working out a notion about blame and thinking about responsibility and accountability. And there's a very complex and sort of robust handling of that. It's not a black and white kind of issue in your poems. It's more nuanced and more complex in ways that feel really authentic and engaging. And the ghazal is just stunning, beautiful. Thank you for this.
Oh yeah,
thank you. Thank you.
You make it sound so easy to write. That's the thing about form, right? I see people are shaking their heads, right? When it works, it sounds so easy, right? Otherwise, you're tearing your hair out over it. Yeah. So let's see, we have comments in the chat. Does anybody want to make another comment with your voice, or shall I read the ones in the chat? Anybody? Question? Okay, I'll go to the chat. And then if you, oh, I thought Mary Marcia had her hand raised. Yeah, there you are. Go ahead. Don't forget to unmute.
So, I loved your reading. I love both of your readings, but your Masquerade is so story brought about that I wondered, did you keep a journal or did you go back and think, because there's certain details that seem like that are amazing and also engineered. So we said the one that caught it was the unfiltered camel. That the way you described it was it seemed really spot on. Second, it seemed to me that the poems are free, and then there are forms, or perhaps some that have a bit of form in it but break out. I don't know if you'd speak to either of those, but
yeah, I can do that. Some of the poems are written in form, as you said, the triolets, the ghazals. There's a sestina, which I didn't read, and then a number of poems that's sort of what I call poetic palimpsest, where they're sort of based on the rhetorical structure of another poem. And if you have the book, there's a whole sequence in there called stress/disorder. Instead of stress, stress stress disorder is a sort of we talk about PTSD, but I just did stress disorder. And one of those poems is based, it sort of follows the structure of another poem that I was really kind of, when I came upon it in a literary magazine years later by this person, I was like kind of shocked. Oh, wow. Because I could remember that exact scene, and it was interesting to read it from his perspective. So I wrote my own reply to it. His was called Imhotep. Mine is called Blues for Imhotep. And that's about as close as I get in the whole sequence of these poems to revealing the identity of who he is, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Well, who he is a real person, but it's not an important thing, because this is not a gossip. This is not, trying to, tell, I don't know, speak truth to power or whatever, but it's just to tell the story from the perspective that's not told that often, the woman's point of view, especially in an interracial relationship, and so that's another form. And then, there's various other poems that have structure to them. There's a canzone. The first canzone I ever committed. It's called Canzone Head On, in which there are two forms of head-on encounter. One is a literal head-on bus crash. And then when the speaker arrives a couple days late to New Orleans, there's the head-on of the encounter with the fact, the details, the clues that he has been having another affair while she has been away teaching in another state. So, that was a fun form. I sometimes what I do, a lot of the earlier poems were written sort of free verse. And then as I was writing, poems years later, I found that form, I was trying to find specific forms that worked for specific stories. So a canzone and a ghazal, and a ghazal, ghazal can be narrative, and also sestina. These are poems where you have certain limitations. You have to have certain end words in a certain order in both the sestina and the canzone, and that compels you to stay with the subject matter and to tell the narrative, So I found that really workable. And the detail about the unfiltered camel, that's what my mother smoked.
Yeah, so you didn't have to make that one up, did you?
Nope.
Well, I was thinking the question that actually could relate, it could be for both of you, actually, the question about writing something painful and the healing purposes of it, and also how you wrote it. Like, did you write it while it was happening? Is it a compilation of things that you wrote a long time ago and then you wrote afterwards? And so it's a question I have for both of you. I wonder if Ruba, maybe you could speak to that. Is that the question that you had, Billy? Is that right? Am I getting that question right?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah. So go ahead, Ruba.
Sure. It's a good question. I think in my experience of writing this book, well, first the question of whether or not it's healing, I would say definitely yes. But what happened in my situation was that there were other things I was writing about. And when my father fell ill, it was very sudden and unexpected.
Oh.
And I didn't write for quite some time because we were, our family was going through a lot of changes. But in time, when I did start writing again, I felt myself wanting to pick up what I had been writing. And and because there was so much, so many new challenges to deal with in reality, around chronic illness and issues of questions around mortality, I didn't want to write about those things. I wanted the writing to be almost respite from that, almost an escape. But what I found is that I was just sort of stagnating with a bunch of material that was no longer authentic to what I was preoccupied with. And I avoided it for a long time and wasn't getting anywhere with the work that I was writing. And about a year out from my father's death, something inside me just dissolved, and I started writing dozens of poems, pretty much, a lot of what ended up in the book, but it took some time. And I can't really say what it was apart from the passage of time that made that, sort of block dissolve. But it did. And when it did, then it was relentless. Every poem was sort of grappling with the same issues.
Yeah, sometimes it's so painful. It's really hard to jump in, or it's kind of like the way the grief process works. Yeah. First it's
I think I had this notion that I could somehow write around it, and I had to learn the hard way. Through the hard feelings was through the hard feelings.
Yeah,
but the writing definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Carolyne, what about you? Oops, you're muted.
Unmute, yes. Well, as I said earlier, there are, like the Faubourg-Marigny poem I read and the title poem, Masquerade, that and a couple of others were written at the time, back in the day. And they were all, pretty much in free verse. The other one called Heat Wave, Liberty, Missouri, that was also written at the time. And then there was a period of time where in real life, after the female and the speaker of the book moves on to her life and a different teaching job in another part of the country, and then on to India, Bangladesh, trips back to Seattle, and on and on and on. Then a number of years passed, and all of this was sort of not really in her mind that much. And then there was this experience in the mid-90s where, as a member of the American Literary Translators Association, because several of the books of translation came out then in the 90s, first half of the 90s. Then at this conference, this Alta conference took place at the university where this person was now teaching. He was not present. He was not on campus. He was away for a year somewhere else. Somehow I knew that, this was sort of just before the internet got big, but there were ways to learn about, you'd see announcements that so-and-so has just gotten a big grant to go teach somewhere else for a year, some named fellowship or named chair. So, I felt, it was good to go to that conference and not be running into anything inconvenient or anyone. But then I did allow myself to take a walk one afternoon during the conference, and I went into the department where he was teaching, and I walked down the halls, an English department, right? I walked down the halls, saw the name tag on the door, but somebody else was in there, I guess the sabbatical replacement or whatever. And then I was interested. I didn't try to talk to anybody. I just, I didn't try to say, hey, I'd like to come give a reading here next year or anything. I just walked through, didn't meet anybody, went back to the dorm room where I was staying as part of the conference. And that night, suddenly I felt the mantle fall upon me. I was writing something unrelated, and suddenly these lines began to pour out. They were called Recollections in Blue. And
sounds sounds a little bit like Ruba's experience.
Yeah, it just poured out.
Shifted.
And then I realized I had to write about the experience this whole life. And so this was like 1996. And so then I began going back to those older poems, which, had been in magazines and things. And then I began writing new poems by remembering various scenes, and everything came to me sort of the way scenes in a play, so that it was very, very much like, and also I'd find myself mentally blocking out scenes, where were the two of them seated, where were they standing, where were they walking?
Oh, interesting.
And so I don't know, I guess I have a good memory because I remembered most details.
Someone was asking if you kept a journal, but it sounds like it was really you could go back in your mind and sort of see it and remember it that way.
Yeah, and I did go back to some journal pages for some details, but a lot of the details that I wrote about in the journal were not really really relevant. But yeah.
So you know what I'm wondering about? I'm just wondering if anybody else who's here has had the same experience that they're both talking about, and maybe would like to share that. You know, I think it's really it's a part of the writing life in a way, you know, that you somehow you know, you want to write something, and then you sort of, I don't know, I'm speaking for myself, maybe now you want to, Robbie says she's had that experience. So do you want to talk about that a little bit, Robbie?
Okay. I never kept a journal because when I tried, it just seemed artificial, but these images of experience of places and things that happen just are indelible, and they keep coming up. So when I write about them, they're there. They're low-hanging fruit that I can pick and write about. But it struck me that you can write about those in free verse, but if you're writing something really fraught, I can see where the forms come from, because that's the only way that you can deal with those feelings. And I don't really write in form a lot, but I have one particular poem about my mother's death that I wrote in a golden shovel. And that made it possible for me to broach something that was very painful.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that.
And it took maybe 11 years for me to be able to write about. My parents died 4 days apart from each other.
Wow.
They were both in hospice together. They were 93 years old, and my mother had dementia. And yeah, it was very difficult to deal with, obviously. And I'm an only child, so I had to shoulder all of it myself. But I couldn't write about that. It took me 11 years to, and I'm still working it through. My previous collection in 2019, my father, poems about my father. This one, poems about my mother, and a few about my father too.
Yeah, that grief, it just it does stay, it stays with us. It's there, and it has a life of its own that we have to kind of ride the waves of it. So yeah, does anyone else have a question or comment or anything you want to add? I have one more question. Oh yeah, Kate. Yeah. Please unmute.
I did put it, Carolyne, in the chat, but it was the line that you packed up your car and you rode away alone. And that is just a classic embarkment on self-being and strength. And so I've heard you read it before, but this time hearing it was like, that is a movie. Got in my car and I drove away. I got on my horse and I galloped away.
Really, thank you. Yeah, that was fun. That was an interesting encounter. You know, most of this book takes place over the arc of this relationship, and then the final section is the one that takes the title from that first long rant I was writing when the figurative mantle fell, and which was called Reflections in Blue. That's the title of the final section in this book, where most of the poems in it really sort of take place after the fact, in years later, after the relationship has concluded. She has left New Orleans and gone on to, other teaching jobs and etc. And then, So that was a moment where she created an opportunity to have a reunion. And so that's what happened in that poem. And it was a very interesting and fraught experience. And the poem, you know, writing it as a ghazal was somehow the best way to you know, I don't know what, embody that experience or recreate that experience, you know.
I was thinking about that, Caroline, after you read the ghazal, because, you know, the way Aga Shahid Ali sort of set out the parameters for the ghazal English, he points out that one of the thematic traditions is a tone or a theme of constant longing, you know, unrequited love and constant longing. And I find that so palpable in your poem. And in every couplet, there is that sort of like heart-rending sense of longing and it going unfulfilled. So I feel like you really masterfully bring that tone out, that aspect of the ghazal out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I can feel our group really just kind of leaning in together. Yeah, it's really an amazing experience that we're having based on the depth of the emotion and the music in your poem. So and Muriel's writing about her mom. So yeah, thank you, Robbie, for opening this up so much. Muriel's mom died in 1985, and poems of grief still come up on me sometimes unexpectedly, always with great healing and relief and sweetness. Yeah, so that's I think grief can be so obviously so multifaceted. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something, the poems, it's like sometimes people say, well, why do you want to write about all this sadness, all this grief, all this yearning and longing? But there's something, I mean, I think in order for healing, you know, healing does not mean you forget about it and move on. It just means you learn how to live with it and learn to live live with it, live with the grief as if it were the missing person, the person who has gone on, you know. And I felt that way writing these poems, you know. In a way, the poems enabled me, this poet, to live these experiences again and to revisit them and to have insights about the experiences that I maybe did not have at the time. That you know, revisiting in recollection, you know, what did Wordsworth say it, and the recollected in tranquility, or maybe not so tranquil, in turbulence, but many years later, you know, new insights would come. As I was writing them, I was going through, at the time I was writing some of these poems in the latter half of the 90s and on into the early 2000s. I was having other contemporaneous turbulences, you know, and relationships and uncertainty about the professional future, etc. But going back to these experiences, re-entering these experiences to write the poems, I found myself thinking, I'm looking forward to these past experiences as if they were the future. You know, like when you're really young and your whole life is in front of you and you're looking forward to the future. I found myself looking forward through the past, you know. And it was so I could live with these experiences and dwell with them and enjoy the beauty of them, enjoy the humor and the affection, and then even revisit those difficult moments, you know.
So let me say, I'd like to just make another comment, and I think then we probably should begin to wind down. But that there's you, Carolyne, specifically speak of music and jazz and music infused poetry, and actually Ruba on the back cover of your book, one of the commentators, or whatever you call those guys in the back of the book, the people on the back of your book, said that your book is filled with music. So, and there is something, and to me, music is it's such a healing, powerful healing creative force. And so poetry that has that rhythm and the music, and specifically when you're actually putting in that jazzy, bluesy, type of sensitivity into it, it's really, I think that is very healing. And the other thing I wanted to say was that when you write these things, when any of us writes things that are healing for us, it also is healing for other people too. And that's what's drawing us all together right now, maybe, is that feeling, because we've all had these experiences one way or another. And if we haven't, then we can have empathy for the person who has had them. So, and that's really healing too. So last chance, if anybody else wants to make a comment or has a question.
I'd like to make a comment, if I
Please
may.
do, Don.
The thing that Robbie brought up about using form to deal with difficult topics, I've heard Katie Ford talk about that, and particularly in writing her book, If You Have to Leave. She wrote a bunch of sonnets, and she used the sonnet, and she talked about how it made it accessible to her to confront those things. And what I was thinking when you were talking is that it actually, if it's done right, it makes it accessible to the reader also. It makes it, well, whatever it is that's being described is described in English that's not off the rails so far that you can't figure out what it's about. But at the same time, the form just gives the reader some distance so that they can get it. And it's a power of example for how they can deal with their own stuff. And one other thing I wanted to say about these experiences, all of these, I think that all, the death of a loved one is a trauma for real. And at its core, it's pain and shock. And the shock has to wear off enough so that one can confront what happened. And the focusing on it and writing about it however you do, that allows one to confront it, and as Carolyne said, live with it. And I think that the poems, many of the poems that you both read, really exemplified how well that can be done. These poems that provided the author with distance enough to deal with what they had to deal with, and also provide the reader with distance, while at the same time making the experiences accessible.
Thank you. Well, very well said.
That's wonderfully said. And Robbie just has a comment here about the form mimics the effect of memory. And I think she's referring to Elizabeth Bishop's famous One Art, that great villanelle, which I quoted from when I wrote Write It, right? Urging herself to really confront it and write it, because that's how you confront it when you're a poet, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, let me thank all of you for being here and participating, and thanks so much, and to Don and Ruba and Carolyne. It's been just a wonderful, wonderful experience. You made it so easy for me. I've just really enjoyed every minute. And we see a lot of other people are sending hugs and hearts. And so let me, I want to finish up with a poem of Ruba's that the first time I read this poem, it just went right in. I had a very strong reaction to this poem, and so I'm very happy that I can read it for you, and we can end with that tonight. And the poem is called The White Shirt. And you want to remind me where it's lives at Ruba?
Sure. Yeah, this is a newer poem. It was published in Virginia Quarterly Review recently.
Okay, thank you. The white shirt. Sometimes a teacher proposes we write about something insignificant, or a friend requests that poems and posts not get so political. Imagine something ordinary, something simple and free, a white shirt clipped on a clothesline and fluttering in the breeze. But I can't slip it on with ease, as some might, though I might long at times for a respite. I try to imagine how quiet it must be, caught in a cloth so white it seems to possess no color at all, only the pure bright essence of light and reality. And unlike snakes, why would we molt from a skin we can't perceive? In the ordinary moments of my day, I try not to see in the length of ironed linen, a turban torn from a grandfather's head moments before he's thrown down on a suburban street, palm trees waving quietly, or a burqa ripped from a woman's head as she's shoved like a pinball from fist to fist on a crowded train among men who want to rise and reclaim. Or a towel that wraps a baby born at the border who is greeted by barbed wire and searchlights probing shadows like a white knife. As much as I try, I cannot write of white shirts without likening them first to the hood of a Klansman, a fire in a darkening wood. I can't think of it cloth starched, pressed cleanly into folds, steam rising from hemmed edges, without envisioning heat vanquishing from beneath a shroud of cement. Let me start that again. Without envisioning heat vanquishing from beneath a shroud on cement, from the dark skin of a boy allowed to be dead for hours on a public street, his soul restless and lingering above him, his shirt a beacon of life, of light I cannot turn from, so searing its clarity. From the shirt, a white shirt, I can't unlink the chain of police who stood shoulder to shoulder holding sheets to block the view as though not even the sun could judge who or what had seemed to keep their peace while the boy's life unspooled a ribbon of red downhill. I tried to grasp that in some cultures, white is a symbol of purity. In others, an expression of grief. Wow. Thank you for that poem, Ruba. It just gets me every time.
Yeah, thank you. That's really very powerful.
Yeah. Says it all. Well, thanks again so much, everyone. And
Thank you so much.